If you're a computer RPG player, you probably know about Ultima Online, one of the first commercially successful MMOs. If that's the case, you're also probably aware of an entire single-player RPG series called Ultima, which was highly influential on the CRPG genre. But that was the extent of my knowledge. I wasn't aware of a game, sometimes called Ultima Zero, featuring Lord British and, at least in the introduction, the evil mage Mundane. This game's real name is Akalabeth World of Doom, and it was conceived by Richard Garriott himself when he was still in high school. Join me as I dive into the raw beginnings of Western CRPG history, with a good dose of patience, resilience, and curiosity. Hello, and welcome to Evernghost Games. I'm a bit of a completionist gamer who mainly plays RPGs. I named my channel after my Ultima Online character from about 25 years ago, so recently it occurred to me that for this very reason I should play the series. I also wanted to experience and bring to the channel the birth and evolution of the Western CRPG genre. But a surprise awaited me. I knew there were many Ultima games in the series, but I wasn't aware of Akalabeth World of Doom, a game originally released in 1979 or 1980. Sources conflict, and I'll explain why later. I noticed that many gamers skip this title and jump straight into Ultima 1. But after a bit of research, it became clear to me that Akalabeth is an important game. It introduces core elements that would define the series. Lord British is here, in his castle, giving you quests. And since this is an old game where reading the manual is essential, you can find Mundane's backstory within it. For those who may not know, the evil mage Mundane is the antagonist and final boss of Ultima 1, the first Age of Darkness. At this point, I realized that playing Akalabeth was crucial to understanding what came later. It's considered to be the first 3D game ever made. Some classify it as a dungeon crawler, while others also see it as the first open-world game. In its original version, without a save function, it may have even been the first roguelike. If its importance is not clear by now, I don't know what else would be. To me, it was a piece of gaming history I'm glad to have experienced. I think titles like Akalabeth represent a vital part of our gaming heritage. They offer lessons that can still inform and inspire modern game development. The footage in this video comes from the GOG version of the game. Also, in this retrospective, I'll use the term CRPG to mean computer RPGs, so as not to confuse them with pen and paper RPGs. I won't be using CRPG to refer to the genre of classic RPGs, like Baldur's Gate, Planescape Torment, Pillars of Eternity, and so on. Lastly, I'm not in the habit of making multi-hour retrospectives. I prefer to keep my videos manageable for both myself and my viewers, so I'll mostly do a video for each entry in the series. Without further ado, let's dive into Ultima Zero, Akalabeth, World of Doom. As time passes, it becomes increasingly difficult to find good sources discussing older games. I've come across a little bit of conflicting information, something surprising for a figure as important to the industry as Richard Garriott. The first thing to note is that the original release date of Akalabeth is, for some people, up for debate. There is an established narrative from interviews and books like the official Book of Ultima, which describe how a young Richard Garriott, still in high school and influenced by pen and paper RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons and books like The Lord of the Rings and The Chronicles of Narnia, began writing code for his games. At the time, computer games were primarily played on teletype computer terminals connected to a mainframe, which were owned only by schools, large companies, or the government. It's a little weird to me that games were run in those environments, but that's how it all started. A program would be typed onto punched cards, which were then fed into the machine. The results would be written onto another stacks of punched cards, which would then be processed by a tabulating machine or a printer to produce human-readable output. If that sounds like a huge amount of effort, it was. Richard Garriott still has his original rolls of punched paper. He wrote a game, felt he could do better as he learned by doing, and started over. Akalabeth was originally titled Project D&D 28 because it was the 28th role-playing game he had written. At that time, there were no graphics, only text. If you've ever heard of Zork, you have an idea what I'm talking about. This 28th game was born from a bet Richard Garriott made with his father. If he could get one of his games to run on an Apple II computer, his father would split the cost of buying one. Apple computers were among the very first personal computers sold for home and office use, and it was a big deal. Their prices range from $1,300 to $2,600, depending on the amount of RAM they had, equivalent to nearly $7,000 to $14,000 today. It was a major investment. In 1979, during his summer break before his last year of high school, Garriott was working at Computerland in Austin, Texas. His boss saw him playing Akalabeth in the back room between shifts, recognized its potential, and suggested that he package and sell it in the store. Garriott spent around $200, everything he had, on a small manual, a cover sheet, and zip bags. His mother, an artist, created the writing on the cover, and another employee at Computerland helped with the artwork. He likely sold fewer than a dozen copies. Then, almost magically, one copy made its way to California Pacific, one of the first computer game publishers. They flew Garriott to California, he signed some papers, and suddenly he was earning money, he was being published. He recalls Akalabeth selling about 30,000 copies and making him $150,000. For comparison, his father, a NASA astronaut, was making $65,000 per year. Here's where things get a little weird. The official book of Ultima emphatically states that Akalabeth, and I quote, became one of the classics of the golden era of computer games. From 1978 to 1981, it was voted as one of the top 30 games by Soft Talk magazine. Maybe I'm missing something here, but why 1978 if the game was first released in 1979? Another source, the Digital Antiquarian, searched Soft Talk magazines and found that Akalabeth was never mentioned before the January 1981 issue, suggesting the game was released in late 1980. Additionally, the Museum of Computer Adventure Game History has digital images of an original Computerland copy of Akalabeth, auctioned with a certificate of authenticity. The date on this package is 1980, not 1979. I don't know where the truth lies, and frankly, I don't care that much. I just thought it was a curiosity worth mentioning. The game was written in AppleSoft BASIC, and if you're interested in delving deeper, Data Driven Gamer analyzed the source code and explained many of the game's system in a blog post. I'll link that along with other sources in the video description. When I explain some of those systems later in the video, I'll be mostly referring to his post, since, while I can write code in some languages, I don't have the time or inclination to learn the basics of, well, Apple Basic. The easiest way to acquire Akalabeth nowadays is through the GOG preservation program. It runs in DOSBox and is compatible with Windows 10 and 11. As for what version it is, I'm not entirely sure. I initially thought it was the 1998 PC version, which includes the Ultima music, colored dungeon levels, and a quick save function. But according to discussion in the GOG forum, it's likely an official fan-made version. The game is even labeled as Ultima 0 in its own main menu, and lacks the original's weird intro graphics. The addition of a save function drastically changes the game. You can only save on the overland, not in dungeons. The original version didn't have a save function at all, likely making Akalabeth one of the very first roguelike games, since dying in the dungeon meant starting over. Maybe it's even the first one ever. Hardcore retro gamers consider the save function heresy, and I can easily imagine how frustrating it must have been to play the game without it. On my very first attempt, I died of hunger before even finding Lord British's castle in the overland. My food simply ran out, and this happened within the first 5 minutes of gameplay. That's how little this game holds your hand. The ability to save scum also makes it easy to cheese the game. For example, by using the magic amulet to become a lizard man repeatedly, stacking bonuses and blazing through dungeons. I'll explain this in more detail in the combat section, but without the ability to save, this strategy becomes a risky choice that can ruin your run. I'll leave it to you to judge the best way to play. I can only report that playing as a fighter was really frustrating, while playing as a mage was incredibly easy by comparison. The key mapping in Akalabeth does not match what's shown in the manual. Nowadays, you can use the common arrow keys to move around. I believe the original mapping was designed for the Apple II keyboard layout, but I'm not entirely sure. The rest of the game accepts direct keyboard inputs. Press A to attack, then select the first letter of the weapon you want to use. R for the rapier, B for the bow, M for the magic amulet, and so on. If you choose A for the axe, the game will ask if you want to throw or swing it. Same logic applies, press the initial letter of the action you want to perform. Q saves your game, while Ctrl Q exits, and Ctrl-R reloads the previous save. The pause key, which is P, didn't seem to have any tangible effect in this version of the game. Press E while in a town or Lord British's castle to enter it, and Z to view your stats, or stats, as Ultima players know well. When in a town, you automatically visit the Adventure shop and can spend money on weapons, or more likely food. The food mechanic is particularly annoying and will persist in later Ultima games. Every turn, or every couple of steps your character takes, they consume food, not when resting or camping, as would make sense today, but even when pressing by mistake a key that does nothing. If you run out of food, it's game over due to starvation, because apparently your character cannot take 2 steps forward without stuff in their mouth. To make matters worse, a certain monster can steal 50% of your food if you get an unlucky roll when they hit you. I understand this food mechanic was introduced to simulate the logistics of adventuring, but maybe this is not the best way to do it. All things considered, Akalabeth is a very old game, programmed by a student in an era when game design wasn't even a concept yet. Be prepared to face some truly difficult and unfair situations, but I have to admit that once I learned the game's quirks, they weren't as overwhelming as initially thought. I've played later games with far worse design flaws than Akalabeth. At the game menu, you are presented with an introduction that gives you the gist of the game's story and mechanics. It introduces the fight between Lord British and the evil wizard Mundane, something you'll take on later in Ultima 1, the First Age of Darkness, and my main reason for playing this game. The various character attributes are explained in a very succinct way. Here, we see how Akalabeth is heavily influenced by pen and paper RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons. After all, this is a CRPG, and pen and paper games are the source of it all. There isn't a real progression system in Akalabeth. You don't have character levels, access to better equipment, or anything of the sort. Instead, you gain more hit points by killing monsters in a dungeon and exiting it. In Akalabeth's code, every monster in the game is represented as an item in a list with an index. The amount of HP you gain is equal to the monster index times the dungeon's level divided by 2, and it's cumulative. The more you kill, the more HP you gain. This monster index I mentioned is important because it influences pretty much everything else. Monsters are ordered by difficulty. For example, a skeleton has an index of 1, while a balrog has an index of 10. That's it. Strength influences the damage you deal when hitting a monster. This damage is calculated by rolling a number within your weapon's damage range, then adding your strength multiplied by 0.2. The interesting part is that all damage, whether melee, ranged, or from the amulet's kill spell, is calculated this way, so having a high strength attribute is always beneficial. Dexterity determines your chances of hitting an enemy and depends on both the enemy's index and the dungeon's level you're in. The actual formula is dexterity minus the monster index minus the dungeon level, all multiplied by 4%. This applies to both melee and ranged combat, though it's unclear how ranged weapons really work. They seem to follow an additional, obscure logic and appear to hit less often. Stamina determines how often you'll be hit by enemies. The formula is exactly the same as for dexterity, except replacing strength with stamina. Wisdom is weird. Apparently, the only thing it influences is the quest given to you by Lord British. When you enter his castle, he assigns you a mission to kill a specific monster. That monster is determined by your wisdom score divided by 3 rounded down, which gives you the monster index of your first quest. After that, he will ask you to kill each subsequent monster in order. In my playthroughs, my wisdom was always in the 20s, and my first target was always a carrion crawler, followed by a gremlin, a mimic, a demon, and a balrog. Since Lord British increases your stats, albeit marginally, when you complete a quest, having a high wisdom score is actually detrimental, because it means you'll get fewer quests. Data-driven Gamer states that a wisdom score of 33 or higher will crash the game, as there is no monster index 11. I haven't personally tested this, so, as my old math textbooks used to say, the demonstration is left to the reader, or, in this case, the viewer. The good news is that I won't be asking you about it on the final exam. Good times. Gold is gained simply by killing monsters. It's calculated by adding the monster index and the dungeon level. So, for example, killing a skeleton on the second level of a dungeon will net you 3 gold. You'll spend most of it on food, since you'll loot plenty of weapons from defeated monsters. The introduction explains the game's controls and recommends finding Lord British's castle as soon as possible. Akalabeth will ask you for a lucky number, which serves as the random seed for generating the overland and dungeon layouts, and then for the difficulty level you want to play. Difficulty only increases the number of hit points monsters have. That's it. It's a bit of a lazy solution, but since even some modern games still rely on this kind of scaling, I won't hold it against a student's project from an era when game balance and design weren't even a thing. Then, on the same screen, you'll see the randomly generated attribute scores for your character, and you can keep re-rolling them if you're not satisfied. We all played the original Baldur's Gate, so no judgment here. Keep wisdom low and everything else as high as possible. Aim for 20 plus in all other attributes and HP, plus enough gold to buy a couple of weapons and a bunch of food. Without enough food, you'll softlock yourself by starving in the overland before reaching Lord British's castle, or a dungeon where you can earn gold to buy more of it. Akalabeth offers two character classes, the Fighter and the Magi. The Fighter can use all weapons, while the Magi can use the magic amulet to cast spells. The Fighter can attempt to use the amulet, but the results are random. Even for the Magi, one spell has a randomness to it, but I'll cover that in the combat section. Now, I know this is a very old game, but let me take a moment to talk about class balance. In my first successful playthrough, I played as a Fighter, and it was brutally difficult, even on the easiest difficulty setting. I had to map out dungeon levels, find ladders to navigate between them, and manually explore every level. At first, I thought this was part of the game's charm, like making maps in Planescape Torment's Modern Maze or Scald against the Black Prairie sewers, but after a while it became tedious and exhausting. I eventually found maps for a specific seed and restarted the Fighter run using them to ease the burden. Then I did a Mage run and my entire life changed. I didn't even need the maps. Once you get a decent number of magic amulets, which is easy early on, you can just cast Ladder Down or Ladder Up whenever you need, and breeze through Lord British's quests. No manual mapping required. I love dungeon masters who make life easier for one specific class, while making all the other players suffer. Moving on. I usually separate exploration and quests into different chapters, but sometimes a game is so thin in certain aspects that it's best to merge them. As soon as you're done with character creation, the game starts in a town, at an adventure shop. Here, you can buy your initial equipment and food. Akalabeth is the first germinal seed of what will become Sosaria. The world isn't yet called that, and there is no specific map as there will be in subsequent Ultima games. But Lord British's castle is here, and we have to find it within a 20 by 20 tile overworld grid to start our one and only quest. This overworld is randomly generated based on the seed you entered at the beginning, so there are many variations. As the manual explains, there are a few different symbols representing mountains, trees, and, most importantly, towns, dungeons, and Lord British's castle. This grid is enclosed by mountains, and you might very well die of starvation before finding the castle. Every move, even every key press, consumes food, and at the start, you don't have enough gold to buy much of it. You can dive into the first dungeon you see, kill a few monsters, and then return to the first town to buy more. Rinse and repeat until you find the castle. But if you get an unlucky draw with the random generation, this may not even be possible. There are maps available online for a few known lucky number seeds if you want to make your life easier. Once you find the castle, entering it will trigger a quest from the Lord himself. A young Richard Garriott put himself into the game under the pseudonym Lord British. Legend says this nickname was given to him by fellow members of the Society for Creative Anachronism, if you can believe something like that existed, because he was born in England and used to say hello instead of hi like everyone else. I've come across a few slightly different tales about how the nickname of British came to be. What I find interesting is that Richard Garriott put himself into the game as a benevolent ruler. I'm not sure if this is a sign of a huge ego or just a funny Easter egg. Anyway, Lord British will greet you, peasant, and, having had a little too much to drink that day, introduces himself as Lord British. He asks for your name, inquires whether you wish to embark on a grand adventure, and declares that you shalt try to become a knight by fighting the monsters Mondain left behind. According to the story, Lord British has already defeated Mondain, but his evil deeds still plague the land. The Lord is looking for brave people to clean up the mess. It really feels like a first-level D&D adventure aimed at young people. Go help the Lord smite some evil. I liked that. As I said, the first monster to kill is based on your wisdom score. Having it too high doesn't really help, because it makes you start from the middle of the monster table instead of the beginning, and the Lord increases all your attributes by 1 every time you complete a quest. This is a Akalabeth game loop. Lord British will ask you to kill a specific monster, you'll do it, return to report the deed, and then he'll tell you to kill the next one on the list. I suppose you could enter random dungeons just to grind gold and hit points, but it doesn't make much sense. The best strategy is to find the nearest dungeon to both the castle and the town for supplies, then delve into it. If you're playing as a fighter, or this is your first run and you're unfamiliar with the game, the early stages will be grindy. By the game's logic, you need to kill a fair number of low-level monsters to gain enough gold and HP to handle more dangerous foes in deeper dungeons levels. These rewards are based on the monster index and dungeon level. The higher they are, the greater the rewards, which is exactly what you expect. I remember when I was a kid, studying my first edition D&D manuals, and dungeons were divided into levels, with monsters and treasure becoming more powerful and rewarding the deeper you went. The danger also increased. I have to say, Akalabeth follows the same logic, more or less, once again showing how Richard Garriott was influenced by pen and paper RPGs. By the way, I don't own an original red box, only a later version, but I'd love to grab one now wildly overpriced someday. So, subscribe to the channel, and I kindly thank thee for helping in my mission. Anyway, dungeons are presented in a wireframe first-person view. Akalabeth is believed to be the first CRPG to use such graphics. In this version of the game, you move forward with the up arrow, turn left or right by 90 degrees with the left and right arrows, and do a full 180 with the down arrow. This last one is useful in combat to avoid taking too many hits. Dungeons are divided into levels, and each one is randomly generated based on your initial seed. Maps for certain seeds exist, making exploration easier. I'm not sure if there's a limit to how deep you can go. I reached level 11, but since all the monsters you need to kill for the endgame, if we can call it that, appear at level 9, there is little reason to go deeper unless you just want the challenge. Since the game only tells you your dungeon level when you enter it, you can easily lose track. The GOG version color codes dungeon levels to help with this, a feature that I believe was introduced in the Ultima collection DOS port. Certain monsters only appear at a minimum dungeon level. The game determines this by taking the monster index, subtracting 2, and checking if the result is smaller than or equal to the dungeon level. If so, that monster has a 60% chance of spawning somewhere on that floor. I don't know how reliable my source was on this, since I've never found a mimic before level 8, and I did multiple runs of Akalabeth. Maybe it was just bad RNG. As I said, after killing your first quest target, you return to the castle, turn in the quest, and receive the next one. Each subsequent quest requires you to kill the next monster in the index list. Lord British should reward you by increasing your stats, even though it doesn't explicitly say so. The final monster to kill is a Balrog in level 9, and you don't even need an ancient, larger-than-life wizard to sacrifice himself to do it. Spoilers, I guess, for a 70-year-old book. Once you return to Lord British with the final good news, he makes you a knight. Congratulations, you've won the game. You can continue playing if you wish, but since there are no more quests, there is little reason to do so. The game suggests trying again on a higher difficulty. I think Akalabeth's exploration and questing systems are historically significant. While the game world is very small by modern standards, it was a bold move to give players the freedom to explore and discover locations. Though it lacks variety, the game's use of randomization and open world exploration created a sense of immersion that was groundbreaking at the time. While these features may seem very basic today, we can see here the foundations of what would become the RPG gameplay pillars we all know today. Combat is pretty straightforward and it works decently even today. I was invested enough to find myself cursing while facing a new monster I wasn't sure I could tackle, especially when my character was missing his hits. Monsters will walk right up to you, and you press A to attack. Then you select the weapon you want to use by its initial, and if it's the axe, you choose whether to throw or swing it. The bow shoots in a straight line in front of you, as you might imagine. It's useful for chipping away at monsters before they reach you, or for finishing finishing them off when they're fleeing. If you're using the magic amulet and you're a wizard, you select the spell you want to cast. In combat, it will just be the kill spell. There is a 25% chance that the amulet will break. If the fighter tries to use it, a random spell will be cast. I'll explain how the amulet works in detail later. Combat is pretty fast once you learn the key buttons, and that happens pretty quickly. The weapons variety is pretty limited. Let's go over the flee mechanic. I think it's very interesting in a game this old. The logic is simple. Monsters flee if their HP drops below the dungeon level multiplied by the game difficulty level. Even while fleeing, they will attack if blocked and have nowhere to go. They regenerate hit points every turn by a number determined by the dungeon level plus the difficulty. When their HP exceeds the flight threshold, they will start pursuing you again. The exception seems to be the Mimic, which, while posing as a treasure chest, won't pursue you if it's within 3 spaces of you. I think this flight behavior, while simple, is quite advanced, especially for its time. Heck, I've played modern games with enemy AI far less advanced than this. You can be attacked from any of your 4 sides if the dungeon layout permits it, and situations where monsters attack from 3 or 4 sides every turn are not rare. Add this to their pursuit mechanics, and you may find yourself overwhelmed by a mob of monsters. The good news is that only one monster can occupy a space, so they politely wait in line to hit you. Those queues can be 4 or 5 monsters long. It was pretty fun. One mistake I made with the fighter was underestimating the number of monsters I had to fight while climbing back to the surface after killing the monster the quest required. I got overwhelmed pretty easily because I didn't have enough HP to survive the trip back. The game provides a very limited amount of equipment, as you can easily see in any adventure store. You can view the entire list at the bottom of the shop screen, including prices and damage ranges. At first, I thought the shield would help my defense, logically it should, but it doesn't. It's actually a weapon that does 1 damage plus the strength bonus. Fists do 0 damage, only the strength bonus counts. You can attack with your hands by pressing A and the up arrow key. As a mage, you can't use the rapier or the bow. The fighter can, obviously, and I found it funny that the most damaging weapon at my disposal was a rapier. Not a longsword or a 2-handed weapon, but a toothpick. Behold the mighty fighter, destroying their enemies with a very thin blade like a rogue, or even worse, a bard. I don't like bards. I already explained some formulas when I talked about character attributes, so I won't bore you by going over them again. It's enough to know that your damage depends on strength, your hit chance on dexterity, and your evasion on stamina. I already said that there is no real progression system. You gain more HP by exiting a dungeon after successfully killing monsters, and you can slightly increase your attributes by completing Lord British's quests, unless you completely cheese the game, which I'll explain in a moment. Monsters don't have HP, stats, or anything of the sort. They're just listed in a table with an index, and the general rule is that the higher the raw index, the tougher the monster. Their hit points are calculated as twice the monster index plus twice the difficulty level multiplied by the dungeon level. Since your stamina determines how often they hit you, I was looking for how the game calculates the damage they deal, but I haven't found anything about it. The gold you get from killing monsters depends on the monster index and the dungeon level. The game calls them pieces of 8 in the log, which is slightly confusing since the Spanish dollar, historically called the piece of 8, was made of silver. Never mind. You have to grind a little at the beginning to accumulate gold for food, and that grind can become much more than a little if you're playing a fighter at a high difficulty level. Besides paying attention to monster power relative to the dungeon level, there are 2 you should be especially wary of: the thief and the gremlin. The thief has a 50% chance to steal an item from you every time they hit. That item is chosen randomly from your food and all the weapons you carry. They're a nuisance only at the beginning, since they can steal your weapon, forcing you to fight with your bare hands. Killing them doesn't return your stolen items. Later on, when you have plenty of weapons and food, thieves become irrelevant. But the real bastard here is the gremlin, that little ball with a mouth, eyes and a Santa hat. Every time it hits you, it has a 50% chance of stealing 50% of your food. That's a lot. You can enter a dungeon with 1,000 food in your pocket and die of starvation because of them. Not cool, Richard. Not cool. Of course, with a wizard and enough amulets, you can cast a leather spell when you meet one and get the hell out of Dodge. You're forced to kill only one of them by Lord British. Now, let's talk about the amulet. This strange little object. I already mentioned that the fighter can try to use it, but the result is a random spell chosen from all the possible ones. A wizard can choose which spell to cast from 4 options. Kill, which damages the monster in front of you, Ladder Up and Ladder Down, which create ladders to navigate dungeons without mapping them, and Bad. What's bad? I'm glad you asked. Bad will randomly apply one of 3 effects to you. The amulet can backfire, halving your HP, turn you into a toad, permanently setting all your attributes to 3 and effectively ending your run, or Lizardman. This is the ultimate game cheese. Turning into a Lizardman permanently multiplies all your attributes by 2.5, and this effect is cumulative, meaning you can keep doubling your stats through egregious save scamming and cruise through dungeons punching Balrogs in the face. They won't even hit you thanks to your absurd stamina, and Lord British won't care what you look like when you return. I think this was a big gamble in the original version of the game when you couldn't save. You were essentially risking your entire run for a high reward. The introduction of the save system made this trivial. The amulet has a 25% chance of breaking when used by a mage, but aside from the very beginning, you'll have so many of them from shops or monster loot that it's not really a problem. We may laugh at Akalabeth's graphics today. They feel incredibly primitive, but we shouldn't forget that this was one of the first games to show any graphics at all. Games at the time were mostly text-based. In the Overland, we have a top-down view, with our character represented by a plus sign, moving left and right or up and down. Mountains, trees, towns, dungeons, and the castle all have barely sketched symbols depicting them. A mountain perimeter marks the boundary of the playable zone, which is a 20 by 20 grid, procedurally generated from the seed you entered at the beginning of the game. Then, the graphics completely change when you enter a dungeon, shifting from a top-down perspective to a 3D dungeon view. Granted, it was all a simple wireframe representation, but Akalabeth is considered to be the first game to have done so. You can even see the next monster lined up for you through your current enemy, and while it's certainly crazy, it simply works. This actually makes it very useful to see how many monsters you still have to fight through those wireframe models. It's not a bug, it's a feature. To be honest, sometimes it actually bugs out and shows you the same monsters in the previously occupied space, superimposed over its actual position. You can even see when a monster is coming behind a corner, since the perspective slightly bugs out and draws more lines than before. As mentioned earlier, the colored lines were added in the Ultima Collection version to help distinguish one dungeon level from another, since the game doesn't show you what level you're in except briefly when you enter it. Aside from that, one of the most innovative features in Akalabeth seems to be its use of a split-screen interface, allowing players to view their character stats and inventory at the bottom, while still exploring the game world at the top. It was a design choice that would go on to influence countless other RPGs. I'm not 100% sure if Akalabeth was the absolute first game to propose these features though. I'm just reporting what I've read from magazine articles and interviews. If you know of other games that did this before or around the same time as Akalabeth, please let me know in the comments, and I'll make sure to check them out if they're still available in some shape or form. I usually dedicate a separate chapter to game sounds, but there isn't much to say about them in Akalabeth. The GOG version has a soundtrack, but it's borrowed from the Ultima games. I believe it was a modification introduced with the DOS Ultima collection. Aside from that, the game features some simple beeps that reek of a true retro gaming experience. Let's wrap up this video. Akalabeth is often cited as one of the first RPGs, and for good reason. Its gameplay mechanics, graphics and story were likely considered innovative for their time. Upon booting up the game, you are immediately struck by its primitive, yet I would say charming graphics. The game's story is relatively simple, with you playing as a brave adventurer seeking fortune and glory in the land of Akalabeth. It's the kind of adventure we all played with friends in a tabletop RPG. What sets this game apart is its pioneering use of open-world exploration, randomization, and combat mechanics. It's true that these features seem quite limited today, but they had a lasting impact on the RPG genre as a whole. One of the biggest challenges in playing classic games is the lack of access to the original hardware and software. Many older games were designed to run on specific hardware configurations, which are now obsolete. This makes it difficult for new players to experience these games in their original form. Dedicated retro gamers often spend considerable amounts of money to acquire original, still working computers from the past. Emulation and porting efforts can help, but they're not always perfect, and some games can get lost in translation. I'm sure the Akalabeth experience is quite different in its original Apple II version, with no save function, no colored dungeon levels, and no music. But I'm nonetheless grateful to have had the chance to experience it, thanks to the GOG preservation program, even if in a slightly altered version. In addition to the technical challenges, there is also a cultural shift towards newer, flashier games. I often say how old games didn't hold your hand like the new ones. Try selling a AAA title today that makes the player die of starvation in the first 3 minutes, with an endless stream of new releases demanding our attention. For me, experiencing an old RPG is as important as playing a new one. The Ultima series contributed to creating the pillars of the genre, and Akalabeth was an early, germinal stage of Ultima 1, the first age of darkness. I'm glad to have it in my portfolio of experiences. Please share your experiences with Akalabeth in the comments below. I'm genuinely interested in reading them and comparing them to mine. I'm still wondering, if this is the land of Akalabeth, how did Lord British transport himself to rule Sosaria? Some kind of moongate? Is there a missing link, maybe lying deep in some forgotten box somewhere? Or maybe Richard Garriott just made it up as he went? I'm planning on playing the entire Ultima series, so stay tuned. It won't be back to back to avoid burning out, but it will be done and it will require some time. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Please like, comment and subscribe. It helps me reach more RPG players out there. Take care of yourself and I'll see you in the next video.